The rain hammered down on the windshield with a fury that seemed almost personal. Jack Miller gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white against the worn leather. The mountain road through Northern California had always been treacherous during storm season. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the sky had opened up with a violence that made even the old-timers in town nervous. He was running late picking up Emily from her after-school program. His 8-year-old daughter would be waiting by the window, pressing her nose against the glass, the way she always did when he was delayed. The thought made his chest tighten. Since Sarah died 3 years ago, Emily had developed this quiet anxiety whenever he was out of sight for too long. He couldn't blame her. When you lose your mother at 5 years old, the world stops feeling quite so safe. Jack worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat. During the day, he did carpentry and repairs around town. At night, he stocked shelves at the grocery store. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and it kept a roof over their heads and food on the table. The trailer they lived in wasn't much, but Emily had decorated her small room with drawings and stars that glowed in the dark. She called it her castle, and that made everything worth it. The first rumble came like distant thunder, but Jack knew better. He'd lived in these mountains long enough to recognize the sound of shifting earth. His heart kicked into overdrive as he pumped the brakes, feeling the truck slide slightly on the slick asphalt. Then he saw it, up ahead, where the road curved around the mountainside. A cascade of mud and rock was pouring down the slope like a living thing, swallowing everything in its path. A black SUV was caught right in the middle of it, partially buried, its hazard lights blinking weakly through the deluge. For a split second, Jack's survival instinct screamed at him to reverse, to get away before the whole mountain came down. But then he saw movement inside the vehicle. Someone was alive in there. He didn't think. Thinking was a luxury for people who weren't watching someone about to die. Jack threw his truck into park, grabbed the emergency kit from behind his seat, and jumped out into the storm. The rain hit him like a physical force, instantly soaking through his flannel shirt. The ground beneath his boots was unstable, shifting and sliding as more debris continued to flow down the mountainside. The SUV was tilted at a dangerous angle, its driver's side half buried in mud and rocks. Jack could see a figure inside, a woman, her face pale against the window. She was pounding on the glass, her mouth moving in what must have been screams, though he couldn't hear anything over the roar of the storm and the grinding of earth against metal. He reached the vehicle and tried the door. Locked. Of course it was locked. Through the window, he could see the woman's eyes, wide with terror but also something else. Determination. She wasn't giving up. That made 2 of them. Jack used the emergency hammer from his kit to shatter the passenger window. Glass exploded inward, and muddy water began pouring into the vehicle. The woman scrambled toward him, her movements hampered by something he couldn't see. Her seatbelt. It was jammed. He reached in, his fingers finding the mechanism, fighting with it as the SUV groaned and shifted beneath them. The whole thing was going to roll or be completely buried any second. Finally, the seatbelt gave way. Jack grabbed the woman under her arms and pulled. She was heavier than he expected, or maybe he was just exhausted, running on pure adrenaline. They tumbled backward together just as another wave of mud and rock crashed down where they'd been standing. Jack felt sharp pain in his shoulder as they hit the ground, but he kept moving, half dragging, half carrying the woman away from the slide zone. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed, but he didn't stop until they reached his truck. He got her into the passenger seat and ran around to the driver's side. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. Behind them, the SUV disappeared completely beneath the landslide, swallowed by the mountain as if it had never existed. Jack reversed away from the disaster, his headlights cutting through the storm, and headed toward town, toward the hospital, toward safety. Beside him, the woman was coughing, spitting out mud and water. Her clothes, what had probably been an expensive business suit, were ruined. But she was alive. They were both alive. He glanced over at her. Even covered in mud, even drenched and shaking, there was something about her that seemed out of place. The way she held herself, straight-backed, despite the trauma, the cut of her now ruined clothes, the watch on her wrist that looked like it cost more than his truck. But Jack didn't have time to wonder about any of that. He just needed to get her to the hospital. The woman turned to look at him, and for a moment, their eyes met. Hers were a striking green, clear and sharp despite everything that had just happened. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a ragged cough came out. Jack reached over and grabbed an old sweatshirt from behind the seat, handing it to her. She took it without a word, wrapping it around her shoulders. Her hands were trembling, but she seemed determined not to show weakness. Jack understood that impulse. He'd felt it himself plenty of times. The need to stay strong, even when everything inside you was falling apart. The drive to Clearwater Medical Center felt like it took hours, though it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. Jack kept checking on the woman, making sure she was still conscious, still breathing. She stared straight ahead, her jaw clenched, her hands gripping the sweatshirt like a lifeline. When they finally pulled up to the emergency entrance, orderlies rushed out with a wheelchair. Jack helped the woman out of his truck, steadying her when her legs almost gave out. For just a second, she leaned against him, and he could feel how hard she was shaking. She looked up at him then, really looked at him, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe. Or gratitude. Or just the shared understanding of two people who had survived something terrible together. The orderlies took over, ushering her inside, firing questions at her that she answered in a voice Jack could barely hear. He stood there in the rain, watching until the automatic doors closed behind her. Then he got back in his truck and drove toward Emily, toward home, toward the life he knew. He had no idea he had just saved Alexandra Pierce. He had no idea she was the CEO of Pierce Industries, one of the largest corporations in America, worth somewhere north of $3 billion. He had no idea that this moment, this random act of courage in a storm, was about to change everything. At the hospital, Alexandra sat in the examination room, letting the doctors poke and prod her. She had a few bruised ribs, some cuts and scrapes, mild hypothermia. Nothing serious. Nothing that would slow her down for long. But she couldn't stop thinking about the man who had pulled her from that SUV. She'd seen his face in the lightning flash, weathered but kind. Strong jaw covered in a few days' worth of stubble. Eyes that had looked at her not with recognition or calculation, but with simple human concern. When was the last time someone had looked at her like that? When was the last time someone had risked everything for her without knowing who she was? Without expecting anything in return? Alexandra Pierce hadn't gotten where she was by believing in fate or destiny. She believed in strategy, in calculated risks, in leveraging every advantage. But lying in that hospital bed, still tasting mud and fear, she found herself believing in something else. In the simple fact that a stranger had seen her as worth saving, not as a CEO, not as a billionaire, not as a power player in the business world. Just as a human being in danger. She didn't even know his name. The doctors wanted to keep her overnight for observation. Alexandra agreed, too exhausted to argue. Her assistant would be frantic, and the board would be demanding answers about why their CEO had been driving through a mountain pass in the middle of a storm. Those problems could wait until morning. Tonight, she just wanted to close her eyes and not see mud and rock pouring down around her. But when she did close her eyes, she saw something else. A pair of steady brown eyes in a weather-beaten face, hands that had gripped hers with desperate strength, a voice that had said, "I've got you. You're okay now. I've got you." And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Alexandra Pierce had felt safe. Miles away, Jack pulled into the gravel driveway of his trailer. The storm had finally started to ease, the rain settling into a steady drizzle. He sat in the truck for a moment, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline crash. His shoulder ached where he'd hit the ground. and he was pretty sure he'd pulled something in his back. But he was alive, and so was that woman. The front door opened, and Emily appeared in the doorway, backlit by the warm glow of their living room. She was wearing her pajamas, the ones with the cartoon bears on them, and clutching her stuffed rabbit. Mrs. Chen from next door must have picked her up when he didn't show. He'd have to thank her tomorrow. Apologize for the inconvenience. Emily ran down the steps and threw herself at him as he got out of the truck. Jack caught her, lifting her up despite the protest from his back. She was getting too big for this, but he wasn't ready to admit it yet. "I was worried," Emily said against his wet shirt. "I know, sweetheart. I'm sorry. There was an accident on the road." She pulled back to look at him. Her dark eyes, so much like Sarah's, searching his face. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. Just a little wet." Emily reached up and touched his cheek, her small hand soft and warm. "You're always saving people, Daddy." Jack felt his throat tighten. "Come on. Let's get inside. I bet Mrs. Chen made you dinner." "Mac and cheese," Emily confirmed, "but I saved you some." As they walked into the trailer together, Jack tried to put the evening behind him. He'd done what anyone would have done. Tomorrow, life would go back to normal. He'd go to work, Emily would go to school, and they'd keep moving forward the way they always did. He had no idea that normal was already gone. He had no idea that 3 days later, a sleek black town car would pull up outside his trailer. He had no idea that the woman he'd saved would walk back into his life and turn it completely upside down. But that night, as he tucked Emily into bed and kissed her forehead, listening to her breathing even out into sleep, Jack Miller was simply grateful. Grateful to be alive. Grateful to have his daughter safe. Grateful for the simple, ordinary life they'd built together from the wreckage of grief. Sometimes, gratitude is all we have. And sometimes, it's enough. 3 days later, Jack was under the Henderson's sink, wrestling with a particularly stubborn pipe fitting, when Emily came running into the kitchen. She had that look on her face, the one that meant something exciting was happening, given that exciting things rarely happened in their quiet corner of Clearwater. He figured it was probably a lost dog or maybe a package delivery. "Daddy, there's a fancy car outside. And a lady wants to talk to you." Jack hit his head on the underside of the sink. Cursing under his breath, he slid out and grabbed the towel Mrs. Henderson handed him. "A lady?" "A really pretty lady in a fancy coat," Emily elaborated. "She has a driver." Through the kitchen window, Jack could see the black town car Emily had mentioned. It looked wildly out of place on the Hendersons' modest street. As he watched, the rear door opened, and a woman stepped out. Recognition hit him like a physical blow. It was her. The woman from the Landslide. But she looked completely different. The mud and terror were gone, replaced by polished elegance. She wore a charcoal gray coat that probably cost more than he made in 6 months. And her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek style. Even from this distance, he could see those green eyes scanning the property. Jack's first instinct was to hide, which was ridiculous. His second instinct was barely any better. He wanted to run out there and make sure she was really okay, that she'd recovered from the accident. Instead, he did what he always did. He took a breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked outside to face whatever was coming. She saw him immediately. Something flickered across her face. Relief, maybe. Or recognition. She started toward him, her heels clicking on the pavement, impossibly steady and sure. The driver, a large man in a dark suit, followed at a respectful distance. "You're a hard man to find," she said when she was close enough. Her voice was different than he remembered. Stronger. More controlled. The voice of someone used to being listened to. "Wasn't aware anyone was looking," Jack replied. A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "I never got to properly thank you. For what you did, you don't need to thank me." Anyone would have done the same, but they didn't. You did. She extended her hand. Alexandra Pierce. Jack wiped his hand on his jeans before shaking hers. Her grip was firm, businesslike. Jack Miller. I know. At his surprised look, she continued. I had my assistant track you down. I wanted to do this in person. She reached into her coat and pulled out an envelope. Jack didn't need to open it to know what it was. Money, a reward, payment for services rendered. His jaw tightened. I appreciate the gesture, but I can't accept that. Alexandra's eyebrows rose slightly. You haven't even looked at it. Don't need to. I didn't pull you out of that SUV for money. I know that. But I want to help. You risked your life for a complete stranger. At least let me cover your medical expenses. Or, I'm fine. Didn't even go to the hospital. They stood there, at an impasse. Emily had crept closer, watching the exchange with wide eyes. Alexandra noticed her, and something in her expression softened. Is this your daughter? Emily, Jack said. Say hello to Miss Pierce. Hi, Emily said shyly. Then, with the brutal honesty of children, Are you the lady my daddy saved? I am, Alexandra said, crouching down to Emily's level, despite her expensive coat and the dusty driveway. Your father is a very brave man. I know, Emily said proudly. He's the bravest. Jack watched Alexandra's face as she talked to his daughter. The polished businesswoman facade cracked, just a little. There was something vulnerable underneath. Something that looked almost like longing. He wondered when someone had last looked at her with the uncomplicated admiration his daughter was showing now. Alexandra stood up, brushing off her coat. Mr. Miller, I understand you don't want money. But please, at least let me buy you and your daughter dinner. As a thank you, every instinct Jack had screamed at him to say no. This woman lived in a different world, one he didn't understand and didn't particularly want to. But Emily was tugging on his hand, her face bright with excitement at the prospect of eating out, something they rarely did. Okay, he heard himself say. Dinner. The smile Alexandra gave him was worth the moment of surrender. It was genuine, lighting up her whole face. Tonight, I'm staying at the Clearwater Inn. There's a restaurant there. We know it, Emily piped up. Daddy says it's too fancy for us, but I bet the desserts are really good. Then we'll have to order several, Alexandra said seriously, to test them properly. That night, as Jack buttoned up the one decent shirt he owned and helped Emily into her Sunday dress, he told himself it was just dinner, just a meal with a grateful stranger who happened to be wealthy. It didn't mean anything. It wouldn't change anything. He was wrong about that too. The restaurant at the Clearwater Inn was exactly as fancy as Jack had feared. White tablecloths, candles, waiters in vests. Emily's eyes went huge, taking it all in. Alexandra was already there, seated at a corner table, and she waved them over with a warmth that seemed at odds with the formal setting. Dinner was surprisingly easy. Alexandra asked Emily about school, about her favorite subjects, about what she wanted to be when she grew up. Emily, never shy once she got going, talked about her dream of becoming a veterinarian, about the stray cat that lived behind their trailer, about the book series she was reading. Jack watched, fascinated, as Alexandra engaged with his daughter like a real person, not with the condescending tone some adults used with children. She told Emily about growing up with dogs, about the horses her family had kept on their property. She made his daughter laugh, really laugh, in a way Jack hadn't heard in too long. What about you? Alexandra asked him during a lull. What do you do when you're not rescuing people from landslides? Carpentry mostly. Repairs, renovations, whatever people need. I do some work at the grocery store at night too. 2 jobs, Alexandra said quietly. That must be exhausting. Jack shrugged. You do what you have to do. And Emily's mother? Died 3 years ago. Cancer. The words still hurt to say, but less than they used to. Time hadn't healed the wound so much as taught him to live with it. "I'm sorry," Alexandra said, and she sounded like she meant it. "That must have been devastating." "We manage," Jack said, reaching over to squeeze Emily's hand. "We've got each other." Alexandra looked at them, father and daughter, and something flickered in her eyes. Envy, maybe, or recognition of something she'd lost or never had. Jack wanted to ask about her life, about what brought a billionaire CEO through a mountain pass in the middle of a storm. But he didn't. It wasn't his business. They did order multiple desserts, and Emily declared each one better than the last. By the end of the meal, she was practically falling asleep in her chair, worn out by the excitement and the sugar. Jack excused himself to take her to the restroom, and when they came back, Alexandra was staring out the window at the dark mountains. "Thank you for this," Jack said. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," Alexandra said simply. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Jack felt something shift in his chest. "Can I see you again? I'm in town for a few more days, and I'd like to get to know you better. Both of you." Jack knew he should say no. He knew this was a complication he didn't need, a distraction from the careful, controlled life he'd built. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was, yeah, I'd like that." Over the next week, Alexandra became a surprising fixture in their lives. She showed up at the elementary school playground, where Jack took Emily after her homework was done. She brought coffee to the job sites where he was working. She even came by the grocery store one evening, looking completely out of place in her designer clothes among the cereal boxes and canned goods. She was careful never to overstep, never to interfere with their routines. But her presence was there, steady and increasingly important. Jack found himself looking forward to seeing her, to the conversations they had while Emily played or when she was at school. He learned that Alexandra had built Pierce Industries from a small startup her father left her into a technology giant. That she worked 18-hour days and rarely took vacations. That she'd been on her way to a corporate retreat when the landslide hit, trying to escape the pressure for just a few days. She learned that Jack had been a contractor before Sarah got sick, that he'd given up his business to care for her, that he'd never quite gotten back on his feet after she died. That Emily was his entire world, his reason for getting up every morning and pushing through exhaustion. They were, by any objective measure, completely incompatible. She lived in a penthouse in San Francisco. He lived in a trailer in a mountain town. She commanded boardrooms. He fixed leaky faucets. She wore suits that cost thousands of dollars. He owned 3 pairs of jeans and rotated through them weekly. But somehow, none of that seemed to matter when they were together. When they talked, really talked, Jack felt seen in a way he hadn't since Sarah died. And he could see that Alexandra felt the same way. With him, she wasn't a CEO, or a billionaire, or a business legend. She was just a woman who laughed at Emily's jokes and helped with homework and didn't mind getting sawdust on her expensive clothes when she visited his work sites. Emily adored her. That was perhaps the most surprising part. His daughter, who had been so protective of their little family unit, welcomed Alexandra in without hesitation. She asked when Alexandra was coming over. She saved drawings to show her. She even started calling her Ally, a nickname that made Alexandra's entire face light up. Jack tried not to think too hard about what was happening. He tried not to name the feelings growing in his chest every time he saw Alexandra. He especially tried not to think about what would happen when she inevitably returned to her real life. But late at night, after Emily was asleep, when he sat on the front steps of the trailer and looked up at the stars, he let himself imagine. What if this wasn't temporary? What if she stayed? What if they could build something real? It was a dangerous dream. Jack knew that. But he let himself have it anyway. The bubble burst on a Tuesday morning. Jack was at the hardware store, picking up supplies for a job, when he saw the newspaper stand near the checkout. The front page of the business section had a photograph that made his blood run cold. It was Alexandra, but not the Alexandra he knew. This was the other version, the CEO version, standing in front of a massive building with Pierce Industries emblazoned across the entrance. The headline read, "Tech Titan Alexandra Pierce, missing for 2 weeks. Finally located in remote California town." Jack bought the paper with shaking hands. The article was worse than the headline. It didn't just reveal where Alexandra had been. It speculated wildly about why. About the mysterious mountain man she'd been seen with. About whether this was some kind of breakdown or publicity stunt. About the business implications of the CEO's absence. There was a photo of Jack. It was grainy, clearly taken from a distance, but it was unmistakably him, standing outside the Hendersons' house, talking to Alexandra. The caption called him, "Unidentified local resident." His phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Is this Jack Miller?" A woman's voice asked. "Who's asking?" "Jennifer Chen. I'm a reporter with." Jack hung up. The phone immediately rang again. Different number. He turned it off. By the time he got back to his truck, there were 3 cars he didn't recognize parked near the trailer. People with cameras. Reporters. They swarmed him the moment he pulled in, shouting questions, taking pictures, demanding statements. "Is it true you saved Alexandra Pierce? How long have you two been involved? What's your relationship with one of the richest women in America?" Jack pushed through them without answering, his heart pounding. Inside the trailer, he found Emily huddled on the couch, scared by the commotion outside. He pulled her close, his mind racing. This was it. This was the reality he'd been avoiding. Alexandra Pierce wasn't just a woman he'd saved and come to care about. She was a public figure, a celebrity in the business world, and now he and Emily were caught in the spotlight with her. His phone, still off, showed 17 missed calls when he turned it back on. Most were unknown numbers. But 3 were from Alexandra. There was also a text. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted this. Can we talk, please?" Jack stared at the message for a long time. He wanted to call her. He wanted to hear her voice. To have her tell him this was all going to be okay. But he also knew, with a sinking certainty, that nothing was going to be okay. Not really, because they came from different worlds, and those worlds had just collided in the most public, most destructive way possible. The reporters stayed outside for hours. Jack called the sheriff, who came and dispersed them, but everyone knew they'd be back. In a town like Clearwater, this was the biggest story in decades. The local hero and the billionaire. It was too good, too dramatic, too perfect not to milk for all it was worth. That evening, after Emily was finally asleep, there was a soft knock on the door. Jack looked through the window and saw Alexandra standing there, alone. She looked exhausted, her usual polish slightly rumpled. He hesitated, then opened the door. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I'm so sorry, Jack. I should have told you who I was from the beginning. I should have warned you this might happen. Why didn't you?" His voice came out harder than he intended, because for the first time in 10 years, someone was looking at me like I was a person instead of a bank account or a business opportunity. And I was selfish. I wanted to keep feeling that way. She wrapped her arms around herself. "I never meant for you and Emily to be dragged into this." Jack wanted to be angry. He had every right to be angry. But looking at Alexandra, seeing the genuine distress on her face, he couldn't quite manage it. "Come inside," he said quietly. They sat at his small kitchen table, the same table where Emily did her homework, where he paid bills he could barely afford, where they ate simple meals and talked about their day. Alexandra looked around at the cramped space, and Jack saw it through her eyes. The peeling linoleum. The outdated appliances. The general shabbiness of a home held together by duct tape and determination. "I know what you're thinking," he said. "That this is too different. That we're too different." "That's not what I'm thinking," Alexandra said softly. "I'm thinking that this is the first place I've felt at home in longer than I can remember." They talked for hours. about the media circus, about the pressures Alexandra faced from her company's board, who were demanding she return immediately, about the impossible situation they found themselves in. Jack was a private person living a private life. Alexandra's entire existence was public. "I don't know how to do this," Jack admitted finally. "I don't know how to date someone who's famous. I don't know how to protect Emily from all of this attention. I don't know if I can live in your world." "Then don't," Alexandra said. "Don't live in my world. Let me live in yours." "For how long?" Jack asked. "A week? A month? Eventually, you'll have to go back. You have responsibilities, an empire to run." "I know." She reached across the table and took his hand. "But I'm tired, Jack. I'm so tired of living a life that doesn't have room for anything real. Meeting you, spending time with you and Emily, it's shown me what I've been missing." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't have all the answers. I'm saying this is complicated and messy and probably impossible. But I'm also saying that for the first time in my life, I want to try. I want to find a way to make this work." Jack looked at their joined hands. Hers soft and manicured. His calloused and stained with work. Different in every way. But somehow, they fit. "The board is threatening to remove me as CEO," Alexandra continued. "They say I've been compromised, that I'm making emotional decisions instead of logical ones. They might be right, but I've given that company everything for 15 years. Maybe it's time I gave something to myself." "I can't ask you to give up your life for me," Jack said. "You're not asking. I'm choosing." She squeezed his hand. "Jack, I've spent my entire adult life building something I thought mattered. But what matters is how you feel when you wake up in the morning. It's whether there's someone who cares if you come home at night. It's having a reason to smile that has nothing to do with profit margins or stock prices." "That's easy to say now," Jack said gently. "But when you're back in San Francisco, when you're in those boardrooms fighting for your company, you might feel differently." "You're probably right," Alexandra admitted. "Which is why I need to fight. Not just for the company, but for this. For us. If I let them push me out because I dared to have a personal life, what does that say about who I am? What kind of example does that set?" Jack understood then what she was really saying. This wasn't just about them. It was about Alexandra reclaiming herself from the machine she'd built. It was about proving that she could be both a CEO and a human being. It was about refusing to let anyone tell her she had to choose. "Okay," he said. "Okay. But we do this carefully. We protect Emily first, above everything else. If at any point this becomes too much for her, we stop." "Agreed," Alexandra said immediately. "Her well-being comes first, always." They sat there in the quiet of the trailer, holding hands across the table, and made plans. Alexandra would return to San Francisco to deal with the board. Jack would talk to Emily, explain what was happening in terms she could understand. They would take things slow, figure out how to navigate the distance and the publicity and all the obstacles in their way. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. But it was real, and it was honest. And it was a start. When Alexandra left that night, Jack stood in the doorway and watched her go. The reporters had finally dispersed, leaving behind only an eerie quiet. He thought about everything that had happened since that night in the storm. How a single moment of courage had led to this impossible, complicated situation. But as he went to check on Emily, finding her sleeping peacefully with her stuffed rabbit clutched tight, he realized something. He'd spent 3 years playing it safe, keeping their life small and manageable and controlled. Maybe it was time to be brave again. Maybe it was time to believe that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is also the most important. Maybe it was time to choose hope over fear. The next morning, Jack sat Emily down and told her the truth. About who Alexandra really was. About why there had been reporters outside. About what might happen going forward. His daughter listened with the serious expression she got when she was processing something important. "So, Allie is rich?" Emily asked when he was done. "Very rich, sweetheart." "And famous?" "In the business world, yes." Emily thought about this. "Does she still want to be friends with us?" "She does," Jack said, his heart aching at the vulnerability in his daughter's voice. "She very much does. But it might be complicated for a while. There might be more reporters, more attention. We'll have to be careful about our privacy. Because people will think you're only with her for money?" Emily asked with the blunt insight of children. Jack blinked, surprised. "How do you know about that?" "I heard Mrs. Henderson talking to Mrs. Chen. She said some people would think you were a gold digger. But I know you're not. You love Ally for Ally, not for money." Out of the mouths of babes. Jack pulled his daughter close, overwhelmed by her simple faith in him. "That's right, Em. But not everyone will see it that way." "Then they're dumb," Emily declared. "Allie loves us too. I can tell." Jack hoped she was right. He hoped that love would be enough to carry them through whatever came next. Because the battle they were facing wasn't just about public perception or media scrutiny. It was about two fundamentally different lives, trying to find a way to merge without losing what made each of them whole. Alexandra called that afternoon. She'd met with the board, and it had gone exactly as badly as expected. They were threatening a vote of no confidence. They'd brought in lawyers. They were talking about breach of fiduciary duty, about her abandoning her responsibilities. It was a corporate civil war, and Alexandra was right in the center of it. "They're using you," she told Jack, her voice tight with anger. "They're painting you as a distraction, as evidence that I'm not fit to lead. They've hired a PR firm to do opposition research. They're going to dig into your life, Jack. Your finances, your history, everything." "Let them," Jack said, though his stomach churned at the thought. "I've got nothing to hide. I know that. But they'll twist everything. They'll find your debts, your struggles, and they'll use them to paint you as someone who's taking advantage of me." "Maybe I should step back," Jack said. "Let you deal with this without the complication of—" "No," Alexandra interrupted firmly. "That's exactly what they want. They want me isolated and controllable. I won't let them do that. Not anymore." Over the next 2 weeks, the battle escalated. Articles appeared in business publications, questioning Alexandra's judgment. Think pieces debated whether CEOs should be allowed personal lives. Social media exploded with opinions about the billionaire and the blue-collar worker, most of them unkind. Jack tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. People in Clearwater started treating him differently. Some with newfound respect, seeing him as someone who'd caught the eye of a powerful woman, others with suspicion, wondering what he was really after. The looks, the whispers, the changed dynamics. It all weighed on him. Emily faced it too. Kids at school asked intrusive questions. Teachers watched her with concern. The simple, uncomplicated life Jack had worked so hard to build for her was crumbling. He was seriously considering ending things with Alexandra, for both their sakes. When something unexpected happened, the board made their move to oust Alexandra from Pierce Industries. They leaked information about her erratic behavior to the press. They painted a picture of a CEO who had lost her focus, who was making decisions based on emotion rather than logic. They had underestimated Alexandra Pierce. She called an emergency press conference. Jack watched it on the local news, his heart in his throat. Alexandra stood at a podium, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. She looked calm, composed, and absolutely certain. "I've given 15 years of my life to Pierce Industries," she began. "In that time, I've tripled our revenue, expanded into 6 new markets, and built a company culture focused on innovation and integrity. But apparently, that's not enough. Apparently, because I dared to have a personal life, because I met someone who makes me happy, I'm now considered unfit to lead." She paused, letting that sink in. 2 weeks ago, I was in a car accident. A landslide. I nearly died. And a man I'd never met before risked his life to save me. He didn't know who I was. He didn't expect anything in return. He just saw another human being in danger, and he acted. Alexandra's voice strengthened. That man is Jack Miller. Yes, we've been seeing each other. Yes, I care about him deeply. And yes, I'm aware that this makes some people uncomfortable. But I refuse to apologize for finding happiness in the midst of a life that has been all-consuming. I refuse to accept that being a successful CEO means giving up every aspect of humanity. The room erupted with questions, but Alexandra held up her hand. The board has the right to call for a vote. They have the right to question my leadership. But I want to make something very clear to our shareholders, to our employees, and to anyone watching this. I am not abandoning Pierce Industries. I'm fighting for it. I'm fighting to prove that we can build companies that don't require total sacrifice from the people who run them. I'm fighting for a future where success doesn't mean being lonely and isolated and inhuman. She looked directly into the camera. To Jack, if you're watching this, I'm sorry you got dragged into this mess. But I'm not sorry I met you. And I'm not going to let anyone tell me that caring about you makes me weak. It makes me human. And that's exactly the kind of CEO I want to be. The press conference ended. Jack sat frozen on his couch. Emily beside him. Both of them stunned. She's really brave, Emily said quietly. Yeah, Jack managed. She really is. His phone rang. It was Alexandra. I hope that was okay, she said, sounding uncertain for the first time. I probably should have warned you I was going public, but I didn't want them to spin the narrative first. It was more than okay, Jack said. The vote is in 3 days, Alexandra said. It could go either way. But Jack, I need you to know something. Even if I lose the company, I don't regret this. I don't regret meeting you, or spending time with you and Emily, or any of it. You're not going to lose, Jack said with certainty he didn't quite feel. They'd be idiots to vote you out. We'll see. She paused. Will you be there? At the shareholder meeting? I know it's a lot to ask, but I'd really like you there. Jack thought about it. About flying to San Francisco. About walking into that world he didn't understand. About putting himself in the spotlight for everyone to judge. Every instinct screamed at him to say no. I'll be there, he said. The shareholder meeting was held in a massive conference center in downtown San Francisco. Jack had never been anywhere like it. The scale, the opulence, the sheer weight of wealth and power concentrated in one place. He felt completely out of his depth. He'd borrowed a suit from the pastor at Emily's church. It didn't fit quite right, and his shoes were the same work boots he always wore, cleaned up as best he could. He probably looked exactly like what he was. A working-class man pretending to belong in a billionaire's world. But he'd promised Alexandra he'd be there, so he was there. The meeting room was packed with shareholders, board members, journalists, and analysts. Alexandra was at the front, looking every inch the powerful CEO in a sharp black suit. But when she saw Jack slip into a seat near the back, her entire face lit up. That smile, so genuine and warm, reminded him why he was there. The meeting was brutal. Board members presented their case against Alexandra, painting a picture of a distracted leader who had let personal matters interfere with business. They brought up quarterly reports, stock fluctuations, missed opportunities. They built a compelling case that Alexandra had lost her edge. Then, it was Alexandra's turn. She stood and began to speak. And Jack watched her transform into something magnificent. She wasn't just defending herself. She was defending a vision of what business could be. She talked about sustainability and ethics and building companies that served not just shareholders but communities. She presented data showing that Pierce Industries had actually performed better in the last quarter than in any previous period. She demolished every argument against her with facts, logic, and a passion that was impossible to deny. This isn't really about whether I'm a good CEO, Alexandra said finally. The numbers prove that I am. This is about whether you believe that leaders are allowed to be human, whether you believe that caring about something beyond profit margins makes you weak or makes you strong. She looked out at the room, her gaze sweeping across the faces staring back at her. I believe it makes us strong. I believe that the future of business isn't about exploitation and exhaustion. It's about building sustainable models that allow people, at every level, to have full lives. And if you vote me out today, you're not just voting out a CEO. You're voting out that vision. The room was silent. Then one person began to clap. Then another. Within seconds, half the room was applauding. Alexandra stood there, stunned, as the applause grew. The vote was called. It wasn't even close. Alexandra Pierce retained her position as CEO of Pierce Industries by an overwhelming margin. More than that, she'd won something bigger. She'd won the right to define success on her own terms. After the meeting, after the congratulations and the photographs and the obligatory statements to the press, Alexandra finally made her way to where Jack was waiting. She looked exhausted but triumphant. You did it, Jack said. We did it, Alexandra corrected. I couldn't have fought that hard if I didn't have something worth fighting for. They stood there in the emptying conference room, two people from completely different worlds who had somehow found each other. It wasn't perfect. They still had obstacles to overcome, logistics to figure out, compromises to make. Alexandra couldn't abandon her company, and Jack couldn't abandon his life in Clearwater. They would have to build something new, something that honored both their worlds, without requiring either of them to give up who they were. But standing there, looking at each other with understanding and hope and something that felt a lot like love, they both believed it was possible. 6 months later, the rhythm of their life together had found its groove. Alexandra spent 3 days a week in San Francisco, running Pierce Industries with the same brilliance that had built it. The other 4 days, she lived in Clearwater, in a house she'd bought just outside of town. Not a mansion, not a statement, just a home with enough room for her, for Jack, for Emily, and for the life they were building together. Jack still worked his carpentry jobs, though he'd been able to quit his night shifts at the grocery store, not because Alexandra was supporting him financially, but because she'd connected him with enough high-end clients that his business was thriving on its own merit. Pride still mattered to him, even if she'd told him 100 times it shouldn't. Emily was doing well. Better than well. She had a mother figure again, something Jack had worried she'd never have. Alexandra took her to school on the days she was in town. She helped with homework. She attended parent-teacher conferences and soccer games and school plays. She wasn't trying to replace Sarah. She was just being present, being consistent, being there. People in town had adjusted. The reporters had moved on to other stories. Jack and Alexandra were no longer news. They were just a couple. Albeit an unusual one. The hardware store owner still gave Jack grief about dating a billionaire. Mrs. Henderson still brought over casseroles and unsolicited advice. Life had mostly returned to normal, just with some unexpected additions. On a quiet Sunday morning, Jack found Alexandra in the kitchen of her house, making pancakes for Emily. She was wearing jeans and one of his old flannel shirts, her hair in a messy bun. She looked nothing like the CEO who commanded boardrooms. She looked happy. "I've been thinking," Alexandra said, flipping a pancake with surprising competence. "That's usually dangerous," Jack teased. She smiled. "I want to start a foundation. Using Pierce Industries resources to help small towns like Clearwater. Economic development. Infrastructure. Education. I want to make a real difference, not just write checks." "That sounds amazing," Jack said. "I want you to help me run it," Alexandra continued. "You know these communities. You understand what they need because you've lived it." Jack stared at her. "Alexandra, I don't have any experience with. You have exactly the experience we need. Please. I can handle the business side. But I need someone who can see past the spreadsheets to the actual people we're trying to help." Someone who won't let it turn into another corporate initiative that looks good on paper, but doesn't actually change lives. He thought about it. About using his knowledge, his struggles, his understanding of what it meant to barely scrape by, to actually help others. It wasn't the life he'd imagined for himself, but maybe that was the point. Maybe the best life isn't the one you plan, but the one that finds you when you're brave enough to take a chance. "Okay," he said, "let's do it." Emily came running down the stairs, still in her pajamas, and threw herself at both of them in an enthusiastic group hug. This, Jack thought. This was what they'd fought for. Not wealth or status or headlines. Just this. A kitchen filled with morning light. Pancakes burning slightly on the stove. A little girl who felt safe and loved. A partner who challenged him to be better while accepting exactly who he was. He'd saved Alexandra from a landslide. But in doing so, she'd saved him too. From a life that was merely about survival. From believing he didn't deserve more. From the fear that had kept him small and safe and alone. Love, real love, requires courage. It requires risking everything on the fragile hope that somehow, against all odds, two imperfect people can build something beautiful together. Jack had learned that lesson the hard way. But standing there in that sun-filled kitchen, with his daughter laughing and the woman he loved burning pancakes, while trying to pretend she wasn't, he knew it had been worth it. Every risk, every challenge, every moment of uncertainty, all of it worth it for this. For them. For the life they'd chosen together. And that, more than any rescue from a landslide, was the real act of courage.